JavaServer pages is the subject of today's lecture, which is lecture number 6. And what we shall do is introduce the JavaServer pages concept and show you how to write some pages. You'll have noticed, no doubt, that there are problems with Java servlets when it comes to sending HTML to the web browser. The problem is not technical, it's really one of easiness of use from the programmer's point of view. It's a real pain in the neck, really, to have to embed HTML text as part of a string. So you have, for example, out.println, and then as you start putting in your HTML tag, you then find that you need a double quote, and therefore you have to put in a backslash to make sure that it escapes that double quote to make it part of the string. And so it can be rather awkward to do this. One of the very nice things about JavaServer pages is that HTML can be embedded naturally, exactly as if you were writing it in an HTML file. Now, the JavaServer page lifecycle begins with writing the JSP code as an ordinary text file. And the text file has got a .jsp extension. It contains a mixture of JSP code and HTML, which is embedded in it. And then we will save that file in the web folder of the NetBeans project. Now, when that file has been written, so it starts off as a JSP file. When that file is first requested by a client, a few things happen. The first thing is that the JSP will be converted automatically into a Java servlet. So our file that we might call x.jsp now becomes x.java, and it is then converted as a servlet. Now that servlet will have been automatically generated by the basically the servlet container. Then, of course, as with any ordinary servlet, the next stage is for the servlet to be compiled. And so we end up with an x.class file. And having been compiled, that class is now loaded, ready for execution as a servlet. That's what happens on the very first time the JSP is requested. When that file, that XJSP file, has been requested a second or third or any other number of subsequent times, then the servlet container will first check to make sure that the JSP file has not changed since last it was converted into a servlet. If it has not changed, then all that happens is that the compiled class file will be executed. On the other hand, if there have been changes, then the changed JSP file will have to be converted again by generating a new servlet file, and that new servlet file will then have to be compiled again. And then the new version of the compiled servlet is executed. Of course, that process of converting the JSP to a servlet and then compiling the servlet, that takes time. And therefore, we don't want our users to have to experience that delay. But of course, if you're being professional about this, your users will never see a servlet that has not been used before. Because what you will do as a dedicated professional is to put your you'll put your Java server page onto your system, and then you will test it. And as part of that testing, you will have to request it, which means that it will be converted to a servlet and then compiled. And therefore, your users should never, ever see that particular delay that goes through on the first request. So the JSP file structure, very simple. On the very first line, we'll put something like this, which indicates that this is a page whose language is Java, and in this example what we're going to do is to output text which is HTML. And then the rest of the file can be, well, it can be whatever we need it to be. It could be just HTML, but that is absolutely pointless, because if all you're going to do is write HTML in there and nothing else, you might as well use an HTML file, because the HTML file doesn't have to go through the process of being converted to a servlet and then compiled. And in any case, HTML is static. And so you might as well put it into a static file instead of into a JavaServer page. On the other hand, you might have only Java code in there, and that's possible. But again, that's almost pointless, because if you're going to do that, then you might as well simply write a servlet, because then you don't have to go through the process of converting a JavaServer page into a servlet. You might as well write the servlet directly. And therefore, the whole point of JavaServer pages is that we mix Java code and HTML. So here's an example. We've got on the first line here that standard line to introduce the page. And then we've got something, I'll give you the proper name of this a little bit later, but it's a tag essentially that says this is Java code in the JSP file. So the less than percent starts the Java code, and the percent greater than terminates the Java code. And you can have as many of these as you want. So what we've got here is a piece of Java code with then some embedded HTML. And it's quite possible that we'd want to put some more Java code in between some of this stuff. And that's okay, we can do that. Examples of that will follow. What we've got here is essentially a shorthand way of putting in a piece of Java code that says out.print and then, in this case, message. More about that in a while. Now, because the JavaServer page is converted to a servlet, then the variables that we're familiar with, such as the request and response parameters, are also available in a JavaServer page. They are automatically available because in the conversion process from JSP to servlet, that will be part of the standard servlet setup that we've already seen for the last few weeks. And therefore, we can make use of these, what are known as implicit variables, by typing Java code that would be exactly the same as if we put it in a servlet. So for example, this string str is made equal to request, so there's the implicit variable, which is exactly as we would expect it to be in the servlet, dot get parameter, and then the parameter name. We're familiar with the scopes of visibility that servlets have. So there is the request scope, the session scope, and the application scope. These are available, of course, in JavaServer pages too, because the JSP file will be converted into a servlet. The only slight variation is that the variable session can be used directly instead of having to call request.getSession. But we could call request.getSession if we wanted to. But the session variable is going to be set up in the servlet as a variable called session that is made equal to request.getSession. And the implicit variable application is also going to be set up, and that's of course going to be equivalent to the servlet context. And in exactly the same way as we can in servlets, so we can do in JSPs. We can set, get, and remove attributes from these various scopes. But JSP has got a fourth scope, which is called the page scope. And this is accessed by the implicit variable that is called page context. And we can add attributes into that scope. We can get them, we can remove them. Now the page scope is a scope that is fixed to a particular page that is processing a particular request. So in a sense it's a narrower scope than the request scope, because the request could be passed to many servlets and many JavaServer pages and would be available in all of those servlets and pages. Whereas the page scope is only available for that one page that is processing the given request. Now I've mentioned some of these implicit variables already, the scopes, the response object, there's a request object as well, and we also have an out variable, which is exactly what we've been writing in the servlets anyway, where we've set up a print writer object called out that is made equal to the response.getWriter. That's declared for us and set up for us as part of that conversion into a servlet. So we can use the out variable as if it had already been declared. The exception variable is set up only for JavaServer pages that are nominated as error pages, and I'll talk more about that in a few moments. And also the config variable is set up with initialization information about the servlet, or indeed, of course, the JavaServer page. Now there are some standard elements available in JavaServer pages. 3 types: directive, scripting, and action. The directive has these 3 types of element. Scripting has got these 3, and action has got those 9. And we'll talk about some of those in this lecture. Those that aren't covered you can get more details about in books and online. So let's look at the include directive. This is a statement that we can insert at any point in the JavaServer page, and at that point that it's inserted, that will be the place where the contents of the nominated file, in this case XXX, the content of that file will be inserted to replace the include directive. So this is a shall we say, a physical insertion of the file's contents into the data stream that comes out of this JavaServer page. The only thing to note really is that the file that is inserted cannot be a dynamic file. It has to be a static file. It cannot be a servlet or a JavaServer page. So it would have to be a text file or an HTML file or something like that. And we can have as many of these include directives as we want. We know that it's a directive excuse me. We know it's a directive because after the less than % sign there is an at symbol, and that tells us that this is a directive. Another directive, and we've already met one version of them, is the page directive, and we can list one or more attributes such as language, which is the one that we've seen already, where we specify that the language is Java, which, by the way, is the only language available for JavaServer pages at this point. We can specify, for example, the error page, which is nominating the JavaServer page that should be invoked should an exception occur in this page. We could set also this attribute is error page. If that is set to true, then the exception implicit variable will be made available to that page. Is error page set to false? Means that the exception implicit variable will not be available. So let's look at a few of these attributes. Content type. We can specify what kind of value that is and what kind of information is being sent back to the web browser. That is a standard piece of information that is typically sent back to web browsers. And if you have a look at some of the header information on a web browser page, or a page that the web browser is displaying, you'll find that this content type will have been set. It could be HTML, and of course our clients thus far have all been web browsers processing HTML. But it could be other things like text/XML and so on. The error page I've already mentioned. The import. Now this is quite useful because when we're writing our Java code that's inside the JavaServer page, there are times when we want to make use of classes that are outside of the scope of this class as it will be when it's generated. And so we would want to insert things. For example, java.util.vector or java.util.date or calendar or whatever. There might even be some SQL things, classes that we want to import. And so we've got a choice. If we want to import them, then we would have to have the page directive import equals, and then in double quotes, the class or package that we want to import. We could have multiple imports by putting in a separate page directive for each one, or we could have a single import page directive and list all the imports, separating the various items with a comma. Now let's think about this declaration element. We have to be really careful with this. And the reason is because when we do an import, and we can, a declaration, we can tell it's a declaration because of the exclamation mark here. What happens is that that declaration becomes an instance variable of the servlet. Now in the last lecture we were talking about thread safety. And if we declare object variables in our servlets, we could, if we're not very careful, violate thread safety of the servlet. And because this JavaServer page is going to end up as a servlet, then we have to be very careful about thread safety for that as well. And in fact, if I come back up a couple of pages, we can see here we are declaring is thread safe equals true, or is thread safe equals false, because it's possible for us to violate thread safety by making an unwise declaration of an object level variable, and thus we should say is thread safe equals false. But if we've been very careful about thread safety and we've not done any declarations that are going to violate thread safety, then we can set is thread safe to true. Now the thing about this is that whatever declaration we put in there, it has to be a valid declaration for, in this case, Java. So for example, we could put, instead of XXX, we could put int num, semicolon. Having made that declaration, it will then, in the conversion process from the JSP to the servlet, it will be put within the servlet class, but outside of any method. And that's, if you remember from last week, is what violates the thread safety if we're not very careful. A scriptlet element. This is what I said I'd tell you about a little bit earlier. This is where we embed our Java code. And it's called a scriptlet. The XXX can be any number of valid Java statements. So here we have a code, an example of the code, where we're declaring a num. Now, that is not a declaration like this one is. This is a declaration of a variable, and it will end up as a variable that is local to the method. It's not an object level variable because it isn't declared as a declaration element. It's declared as part of the Java code. And this Java code will be inserted into the method. it's not called the process request method in the generated servlet, but if we were writing it in NetBeans, that's the method that we would put it in the process request method. So all of these scriptlets will end up inside the process request method or its equivalent in the generated servlet file. And you can see in this example we've got several statements. We've got a declaration of a variable that is initialized to the value of the username parameter on the request. There's an if statement, and within the if statement there's an assignment. So we can put whatever kind of Java code we like in there. Therefore, it is feasible that we could use a Java server page as a model component within our MVC architecture. And that model component could interact with a database and extract information and so on and so forth. But if you're going to go to all of those lengths, then probably you ought to be doing that inside a servlet rather than a Java server page. So typically a Java server page will be used for view components. An expression element is introduced with the standard less than % and then has an equals. And as I mentioned earlier, that is equivalent to having a scriptlet that does out.print and then the value. And the thing we have to note about this value, xxx, is that it must be a valid expression that yields a result that is either a string or could be converted to a string. So we have, for example, the string strut that is equal to hello, and we can output that as an expression element or in an expression element, because that's a string, no problem. In the other example here, num, which has got the value 5, times 6 equals 30, this is of type int. That's okay, because it can, the value 30 as an integer, can be converted into a string. And therefore, the expression element that says I want you to output num times 6 is okay. That will work. You could have an expression in there that is a Boolean expression. Again, that Boolean value, true or false, can be converted to a string. So that's not a problem. You have to be a bit careful about putting objects there, because if you just put the object reference, then you'll probably find, unless you've written the toString method, that what you get is the default output from toString, which is going to be the class name, then an @ sign, and then its address in memory. So if you want to put an object reference inside an expression element, that's okay, but make sure you override the toString method. Now, the include element is different from the include directive. Remember, the include directive is the insertion of a static file, whereas the include element is essentially what we've done already with servlets when we have included the response of another servlet as part of this servlet's answer or output back to the client. And that's what's happening here. The nominated page is going to be the URL of the page, or indeed the servlet, that will be included as part of the output. So this can be a dynamic page. It could be a static file, but it's most likely to be a servlet or Java server page. And as with servlets, so it is with JSP, when you use the JSP : include element, the flow of execution will jump to the nominated page or servlet, and then when that page or servlet has concluded its execution, then control of execution will jump back to this statement and will then continue with whatever comes next. Please note that xxx is not the servlet name, it's the servlet URL, just as it is when we're dispatching a request from a servlet to another servlet. On the other hand, if we're using or including a JavaServer page, then the URL of that JavaServer page is, in fact, the name of the JavaServer page file. Similarly, we've got the forward element, the JSP forward. This works in the same way. The nominated page or servlet is specified here. And as with servlets, so with JSP, the flow of execution does not return to this page. So there's not any point putting any statements after the forward. Now the param element can be used in conjunction with the include and forward elements. And what we're able to do with these is to specify additional request parameters. So the request that has come to this JavaServer page can have parameters on it, and we then can add to it. So this is something that we can do in JavaServer pages that we're not able to do in the servlet. So what we'll do is, in between the JSP include and the end tag, we can insert a number of param tags. The difference between what we're looking at now and the previous examples, which I'll just pop back to, is that because there is no end tag, we don't need to have any other tags as part of this tag's body. We can terminate that tag immediately with that slash there. Whereas here, because we want to put some other tags inside this tag's body, we don't terminate it in that way. We have the end tag, as we might be familiar with HTML tags. So here we have a JSP param tag, which consists of two attributes, the name and the value. So we specify the name of the parameter and its value. Bear in mind that these are going to be strings. So even if you've got an integer that you want to display, that integer will still end up being represented as a string. And so in the included or forwarded page, we will then have to call the request.get parameter, specifying the name as it's written in the param tag. And remember, it comes to us as a string, so if it actually is representing an integer, we'd then have to do an integer.parseInt to convert it back to an integer. So let's take a look at an example, and we'll take note of how the variables are declared, how the expression and scriptlet elements are combined within the JSP along with embedded HTML. And we'll also look to see how the include and param action elements are used. So here we have an internet application, two servlets, a controller and a model, but no view servlet. That's because we're using JavaServer pages for our views. So let's take a look in the controller to see how that changes things. This is dispatching the request to the model, validate input. And we're using the servlet exception mechanism for dealing with any errors. So we're assuming that everything is going to be absolutely fine, all the input is valid, and therefore, having included that particular servlet, remember that's the URL of the servlet, we will then immediately dispatch the request when it comes back to the controller to the view. Now, because this is a JavaServer page, the URL for that is the actual file name for the JSP file. And we, having set up the request dispatcher in this way, we would then do the include as usual. And you can see that the request and response objects will be passed to that JavaServer page as usual. That, of course, is no surprise to us because the JavaServer page will have been converted to a servlet, and therefore we are just essentially including a servlet. Of course, if there is a problem in the validate input, then that's going to throw an exception. So we've got all of that normal processing inside the try block, and then if there's a problem, we catch the servlet exception and we deal with it. In this example, what we're doing is creating an attribute on the request called exception, just like we did in previous examples, and then we are going to include the view error report JavaServer page. So let's take a quick look at the model to see what it's doing. This is going to, and when you run this in your own time to see how it works, you'll see the effect of this. But what's happening is that we're getting from the request parameter the number of tables that we want, because this application is going to output a table of multiplication tables. And the point here is that this value that has been input and stored as a string represents an integer. Therefore, we're going to attempt to parse it. Because it might not parse, because the string might not represent an integer, we might get a number format exception. So we put all of this in a try block and catch the number format exception. And if that happens, then we throw a new servlet exception with this error message. But if this does convert happily to an integer, then that gets stored in the variable num tables, and then we validate to make sure that it is in the range 1 to 20 inclusive. If it is out of that range, then we'll throw another exception, which of course will terminate execution of this try block. And if this condition is false, therefore we'll just jump straight through here to set the attribute called number of tables on the request scope, passing that value. If there's been no error, then the view times tables is invoked. So let's take a look at it. Here's the JavaServer page. We've got the standard first line, and then we're including, this is an include directive, so it's a static include. We're including the contents of the header.html file, which is just a file in our web pages section of the project. So header.html is just some standard HTML that we want to use essentially as the header for every single output that could come. Now in this particular example, we've only got one type of output, or one normal view. But if you've got a very large application, you'll want a consistent look and feel between all of the outputs. And therefore, what we can do is to use these static files, such as the header file, and we'll see in a moment the footer file, that will do all the standard header stuff, and maybe do some structuring of the page and so on. And if we include that in every single JavaServer page, then we're going to get a consistent look and feel. Of course, we can also use in here, as we've got there, a style sheet. We can set up the style sheet, so it's using exactly the same style sheet for every single file that is, or JavaServer page that is sent back to the web browser. So having included the header file, we then get some embedded HTML. Just some standard stuff that is making reference here to an element in the cascading style sheet that was included as part of the header HTML. And then we've got a scriptlet. Now this scriptlet, it starts off by declaring a variable called numTables and making it equal to, well, we get from the request the attribute called number of tables and convert it to an integer. We're also declaring a variable called lower limit, and we're setting upper limit to be num tables plus the lower limit. Then we've got a for loop. Now this will need a little bit of explanation, because what we want here is to embed some HTML within the for loop. So as part of the scriptlet, we have the for loop declaration and the open brace for the for loop body. Then we have to terminate the scriptlet, because now we want to embed some HTML. So in this loop body, we've got an HTML tag for the table header. Then we've got an expression for the JSP, which will output the current value of col. And then we've got the end table header. So what we're going to get essentially is a whole load of table headers, in this case starting at 1, finishing at 12, that goes across in the first row of the table. That being the end of the embedded HTML, what we can do now is start the scriptlet again for the close brace of the loop body and end the scriptlet, because now we want to embed another HTML tag. So by the time that first bit is executed, what we've got is a table with one row, and within that row we've got 12 headers labeled 1 to 12. Then we can get into processing the data, displaying the data. Now here this is all going to be generated, but of course it might be that what you've done is get an array list of beans. And so now what you want to do is to iterate through the array list and output the contents of those beans. The concept would be exactly the same, but of course the Java code itself will be slightly different. But if you've done it in a servlet, then of course you can do it in a JavaServer page. So we have another for loop. This time the value of the loop counter, row, is going to start at lower limit and will go up to, but not include, upper limit. So if number of tables had the value 20, then upper limit has got the value 21, and therefore row will start at 1 and go up to 20, but not include 21. And we're going to increment row by 1 each time we iterate. That's the end of the loop. Sorry, it's the beginning of the loop body, but the end of the scriptlet. So we're going to embed now this JavaServer page action. So the JSP action is an include, which means that this page will now be invoked. It will execute, where it will have the request and response objects passed to it automatically. But what we want to do is to add into that request the attribute called table_num, whose value is equal to the current value of row. So when row first is initialized, it will have the value 1. So on the first iteration, the value of table_num will be 1. On the second iteration, the value of table_num will be 2, and so on. So when that page is invoked, there will be a new request scope attribute called table_num added to it. Let's have a look at what happens. In display row, the first thing it does is to get from the request the parameter called table_num, which was what was set up here. Then it will parse it as an integer and store its value in the variable table_num. Then, and you'll see this when it runs, the table is going to alternate row color. And the way that we do that is by having an expression here, a JSP expression that will test the value of table_num to see if the remainder, when divided by 2, equals 0. In other words, to see if the value of table num is even. If it is even, then we're not going to output anything at this point. If it's odd, we're going to say that the class equals alternate background. You will see the effect of that when you execute this. So that angle bracket there, I can just highlight it, that terminates the expression. This angle bracket terminates the table row HTML tag. Then we've got a table header in which we have got the value of table num. Then we're going to iterate 12 times and output for each one of these a table data cell which will have the value I times table num. So it's going to output let's say table num has got the value 1, it's going to output 1, 2, 3, 4 up to 12. If the table num has got the value 5, it'll output 5, 10, 15, 20, blah, 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 up to 60, and so on. So each time this JSP file is invoked, it will output one table row, an HTML table, containing the multiplication table for the nominated table num. And that will be called, that page will be called this number of times, however many upper limit happens to be. Once that's finished executing, then we have first of all we've got the close brace for the loop body, and then we've got the embedded HTML end table tag. And finally, down at the bottom here, we have another page directive, this time to do the static inclusion for the footer.html file, which in this example is very simple, but of course could include all kinds of other things like copyright notices and so on. And maybe even something in there that would say when this page was last updated. Well, of course, if you're going to do that, well, this page has just been dynamically generated. The static bit that we're now seeing would no longer be appropriate if you wanted to put in the current date and time, because that's something that is dynamically generated, and therefore you can't use a footer.html file because that's static. What you would have to do instead is to convert this to a JavaServer page, and then instead of doing a static inclusion, you would have to do a JSP include down here for footer.jsp. So there we have an example then of removing the view servlet and replacing it with a view JavaServer page. And there were probably two view servlets, one for normal view and one for error view, and therefore we've got two view JavaServer pages, one for error and one for normal processing. If we take a quick look in here, we can see that this too has the static inclusion for the header and for the footer. And what we're doing within that is to get the exception attribute from the request scope, convert it to an exception object, store it in E, and then we can call e.getMessage as part of this expression element of JSP. The effect of that then is to have the standard header, then the error message that's come from the model. So it'll be, for example, user input error, the number of tables is not in the range 1 to 20, or user input error, num tables is not an integer. Whichever one of those it is, that message will then be reported here. And then there's the file footer. And that's as far as this example goes. The tutorial, of course, will give you experience in dealing with these kinds of things in JavaServer pages. Enjoy the tutorial.